The qualifiers for the May Melee are completed, and 20 teams have been narrowed down to 4. This week we saw so much Overwatch, and that meant a lot of close games and quite a few upsets. Hey guys, how's it going? My name is Elias, and welcome to the Overwatch League Weekly Recap. In this video, we'll be going over the matches this past weekend, partially to talk about how all the teams are faring, but mostly to see how my preseason predictions match up to reality. As such, there is a full spoiler warning for this past week's games, so if you haven't seen them, you may want to wait a bit on this video. We'll be looking at all the scores and how they match up to what I thought before the season even started. With no roster changes this week, let's get right into the scores. So, I did pretty good this week, with 6 games being completely correct, both on the scoreline and the victor. Not much to say about these. I think most people kind of predicted them. I kind of felt like Boston was going to be able to take a map off of Washington. I felt like they were a strong enough team on paper, and they did show that. I also kind of anticipated both Boston and London being a very close competition. Again, I don't think London is too bad, because I considered them being able to take a map off of a team such as the Toronto Defiant, which I kind of regard highly. And in the East, you can see how little respect I have for the Valiant. They got 3-0'd both times by both the Charge and the Dynasty. And I also kind of felt like the Shanghai Dragons were going to be quite a bit above New York, once again being 3-0'd. And of course, despite getting quite a few right, I also got quite a few mostly right. These are the games that I correctly predicted in the preseason who the victor would be, but kind of got the scoreline wrong. So Atlanta dominated Paris. I kind of predicted that game would have been a little bit closer. I kind of saw Paris being a little bit better than they have been showing, which, don't get me wrong, I think Paris doesn't look too bad. They are definitely one of the bottom teams, but I kind of anticipated them giving Atlanta a little bit more trouble, mostly because I forgot how good Atlanta was going to be at the rush. As for the San Francisco Shock Mayhem game, I kind of thought that the Mayhem would be able to have some sort of showing. They clearly didn't. I kind of considered that to be a close game because I do consider the Shock and the Mayhem in the top part of my standings, even now. So yeah, that was a little disappointing. The Shock just had the Mayhem's number. As for the Toronto Defiant Washington Justice game, I kind of anticipated the Toronto Defiant being a little bit better, but I knew that the Washington Justice wasn't going to have too much trouble. I kind of just anticipated the Toronto Defiant getting a map off of them. As for the Mayhem Paris game, I anticipated the opposite. I kind of thought that Paris wouldn't be able to get a map off of Mayhem, but they did have a good showing. Paris does have a good rush, and we'll talk more about the teams individually here in a little bit. But because there was so much Overwatch, there's more that I did get wrong, at least on the scoreline. The Shock Atlanta Reign game was so good. That was probably one of the best games this week overall. And yeah, the 3-2 scoreline really showed. I kind of anticipated Shock in the preseason being able to be dominant over Atlanta, but Atlanta has kind of shown that they have an amazing rush comp. As for the Seoul New York game in the East Division, I kind of anticipated New York being able to take a map. I was wrong. Seoul dominated New York. And as for the Shanghai Dragons and the Hangzhou Spark, the Hangzhou Spark looked a lot better this week, and it really showed in their game against Shanghai. They almost had it. They went 3-2, obviously. And I kind of predicted in the preseason that the Spark were going to be halfway decent, but I didn't think they were going to be good enough to give Shanghai a run for their money. That can be said both on Shanghai doesn't look completely strong. They look fairly strong, but they don't look unstoppable this year. And Spark actually do look halfway decent, especially this week once they've started to get stuff together. And finally, the upsets, the games I got completely wrong, which surprisingly, despite how much Overwatch there was this weekend, I only got one wrong, and that was the Guangzhou Charge versus the Hangzhou Spark. Originally, I had predicted that it was going to be a pretty close game. In the preseason, I thought that these two teams were going to be decently close, with Guangzhou being weaker, mostly due to the strength of the East, but I thought that they could take on the Spark, and I gave them a 3-2. Well, I was not just wrong, I was completely wrong. The Hangzhou Spark completely defeated the Guangzhou Charge 3-0, but that was the only upset I had this week, so that's not too bad. Moving on to the individual teams, and starting in the East, I want to briefly say that we saw some interesting things from these teams this week, specifically a lot more rush-style comps. It's nice to see that these teams are trying new things, and I hope that a lot of the comps is more map-dependent than just one main meta, because that's a lot more fun to watch. We also saw a lot of Genji, which was certainly interesting, though the teams that ran Genji did seem to make it work. Now first, let's look at the LA Valiant. Valiant still looks like one of the weakest teams in the East Division, not winning a single map this weekend. The only time this team looked decent was on Control, where I think the chaotic nature of Control was something that hid their weakness. And one glaring weakness of this team is their decision making. There's a lot of bad ult usage, comps that just don't synergize, really slow getting into position to set up plays, which often leads to the early picks and resets. This team is highly disorganized and typically feeds to the enemy rather than taking the point. However, there are some bright spots, and those are definitely Shocheng and Mulleran, who have still some rookie mistakes, but also have a lot of potential. Next up is the Guangzhou Charge. This is a team that is still struggling, despite getting their first win against the Valiant. On paper, this team should look pretty good, but something just isn't clicking. Part of me wants to blame Mandu. I've not been super impressed with him so far, but I don't know if that's the problem, if it's a problem with the supports, or if it's just kind of a timing thing. Hopefully that will come. There are bright spots for this team, definitely. Choice Wan and Eileen still looks really good. I do like when the Charge play the rush comps. They definitely seem more comfortable on that style. And it was also nice to see Rio again, the main tank, who is looking as good as ever. Now moving on to a team that has looked a lot better on the dive than the rush, the Hangzhou Spark. And they looked considerably better this week than previously, and in particular, Shy and MCD stood out. Shy definitely has that clutch potential, which is really nice to see. And this is another team that is a bit slow to set up, which can lead to push-ending picks. But when they do go in, they do execute well, which is nice to see. So I do have faith in the Hangzhou Spark to be a halfway decent team. Now, looking to the Seoul Dynasty, it was nice seeing Marvel back in this game. He's still looking good on Rhine. I kind of expect that they'll play more Marvel when they want to play Rhine comps, Gesture when they want to play Winston comps, because that's what their strengths are. This is a team that does really well playing both the dive and the rush, with some really well-organized dives. And in particular, Fitz looks really good on the Sombra this weekend, and Toyo continues to impress. Seoul does seem to want to experiment a little bit with comps, being one of the teams that played the double bubble Genji, but it worked alright, but that might just be because Prophet was playing Genji, and Prophet's really good. Next up, we have the New York XL. They still have some rookie problems, which, given that half their roster are rookies, is kind of to be expected. Nothing major, just kind of poor ult usage, which could also be a synergy issue, and a bit of hesitancy overall. These things should work out over time, hopefully, but the only other negative is a bit of inconsistency from the DPS. Ivy looks great on May, but his other heroes are a little lackluster, and there's a bit of quietness from Flora and Feather. Although they did show that they have potential and had some good plays over the weekend. Honestly, this is just a team that should get better as the season goes on. So if you're a New York fan, don't give out hope yet. And finally, the Shanghai Dragons look a lot stronger this week after losing to the Hunters in week 1. Fleta continues to impress on May, which was a hero that he had surprisingly looked fairly weak on last year, but looks a lot better this year. Which it doesn't seem to matter too much, as the Dragons do seem to favor the double bubble comps and just the dive style comps in general, especially playing Mercy Zen with the double bubble, which puts a lot of players on more comfortable picks and is a lot of damage for the other team to deal with. One of the biggest criticisms I have against the Dragons is that on some maps they almost look lost, like they don't know how they want to attack the point, which is something that is a weakness that other teams could take advantage of. But overall, the Shanghai Dragons do look really good. On to the West Division, starting off with the Paris Eternal. This is a team that is clearly struggling in the league, but they do have a decent rush comp and look alright on dive. Paris has shown that they are capable of taking maps off of the higher ranked teams. They just don't look solid enough to win against most opponents. Still, I'm still pretty happy with Onigod. Continues to be impressive, as well as Don and Khan this week, and there is definitely a lot of potential there. Next up, the London Spitfire is another team that is struggling early this season, and is a team that, despite wanting to play Rush, certainly looks better at Rush, but is unsure at times how to play Rush properly. This sounds weird, but this team takes odd positioning, or on one map they got really extremely split up when the opponents weren't running Rush. So those are definitely some weaknesses. This team does have some potential, but they really need to start improving. The Boston Uprising is the last team this week near the bottom of the pack. This team looks significantly better, which is good to see. Punk, Mungbong, and Valentine continue to impress. Punk on basically whatever he's playing. Mungbong looks great, especially on the Ana. Some really good sleeps and bionades. And Valentine, his Mei looks a little bit better, but he'd really clearly rather play like Doom, which is a better pick for him. He looks a lot better on the Doom, but sometimes it's a little bit forced. I'd like to see them be comfortable enough to play either, depending on the situation. And when they're not playing the Rush style comps, Valentine does look really good on the Echo. This team is also like to play the Rhino-Risa Rush style comp, which is kind of unique to them, and they definitely look better on the Rush than the Dive. Moving on to a team that looks a lot better despite their record, the Atlanta Reign looks a lot better when they're not playing Rush. When they're playing more of the Dives this week, that was certainly a weakness in the first week they played. And they proved this week in their games, especially against the San Francisco Shock, that their Rush comp is probably the best in the league. If not the best, one of the best. They've had a rough schedule, but I expect to see good things from the Atlanta Reign. So long as the meta favors more of the Rush. If the meta goes to more towards the Dive, I don't think the Reign will struggle too much, but I think they'd be more of a solid middle-of-the-pack team. If the meta is still more on the Rhine Rush comps, Atlanta could be one of the top teams. Now, the Washington Justice look quite good this week as well, and with an amazing tank line just completely dominating the opponents. Mag in particular looks really good, especially on the Winston, but his Rhine is also decent. This is a team that seems to favor the dive comps, which is good since the DPS and support lines also look a lot better on the dive style than the Rush. I still have a problem with Assassin. He's still a sticking point for me, as he looks fantastic, except when he plays Mei in that Rush. So obviously the dive is going to be better for them. And he's definitely a lot weaker on that Mei pick. But next up, the Toronto Defiant. They look decent. I don't know if they are a top team, but they're certainly trying to look like one. They did make their way into the knockouts for the Melee, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And this is a team that just looks a lot better on Rush, although their dive style is decent, except for teams that are really good at dive, like Washington Justice. They have an adequate enough dive that they look fine against teams that also have adequate dive. I think they're right on that like cusp of being a good dive team and not a good dive team, like an average dive team. So Nice continues to impress, and Hisu looks great, except when he's playing Sombra, as he got not one but 2 EMPs canceled by a manual hack this weekend, by the Justice, actually by Assassin. So they definitely have some problems that they need to work out, but I think the Toronto could be a pretty good team as the season continues. Now, the Florida Mayhem, the next team that we're going to talk about, despite some flaws, are looking fairly good overall. There seems to be a little bit of a disconnect between the supports at times, with some mistakes happening that are easily taken advantage of. And one of the other big problems with the Florida Mayhem is OG does tend to overextend, especially when he's playing Winston. which good teams that are able to punish that aggression, that's a really bad sign. But if the team can't handle that aggression, OG pops off. So it's kind of a feast or famine type of situation with that. However, Florida's Rush does look really good. And when they play Rush, pretty much the entire team is on comfort picks, except for OG, whose Ryan is still very good, even though he likes to play the Winston more. You have Yaki. Yaki looks great regardless of what he's playing, really. But getting BQB on the McCree is always a good thing. So this is a team that is also very scrappy. They tend to win fights at the last second a lot of times, which is a bit dangerous, but that's dangerous for both them and their opponent, because it could go either way. And that's something that can be improved. And I do expect to see good things from the Mayhem as the season goes on as well. And finally, the San Francisco Shock continue to play well, despite their early loss to the Outlaws in the first week. This is a team that can play both the dive and the rush pretty comfortably, potentially being one of the best rush teams, although the Atlanta Reign will give them a run for their money on who is actually the best. This is a very clutch team, with Striker doing a lot of carrying a lot of times, especially when Striker is playing Hangzhou. His Hangzhou is very good, as well as his Tracer, don't get me wrong. Shock did try to play some interesting comps. One thing that stood out to me, they tried to play a dive-style Ball Diva comp, but rather than playing Violet on the Zen like most teams would, they had Violet on the BAP. But that's not too surprising, given how fantastic Violet is on the Baptiste. Still, the Shock look to be one of the top teams. The final games this weekend were the knockouts for the May Melee. The top 4 teams in the East and the top 6 teams in the West competed to fill 2 spots for each division to play in this coming weekend, starting on Thursday, in a double elimination tournament. For these games, I will say that I have predicted only the top 2 teams for each division, not the scores for the individual matches, and I made these predictions pretty much the night before, on Saturday, before the games on Sunday, not in the preseason. So with that being said, let's get into the specific games. Starting in the East, the 2 games that were played were the Shanghai Dragons versus the Philadelphia Fusion, and the Chengdu Hunters versus the Seoul Dynasty. For these games, I predicted that the Philly Fusion and the Chengdu Hunters would be the 2 teams representing the East, and while I correctly predicted Chengdu beating Seoul, I was wrong about the Shanghai-Philly game. So the first game was between the number 1 seeded Philadelphia Fusion and the number 4 seeded Shanghai Dragons, and it really could have went either way, as shown by the scoreline, which was 3-2, including a draw on Vizcaya, and it went in favor of the Dragons, obviously. I think a large reason for this upset was simply on Fleta and Lip. Those 2 really successfully shut down Carpe and Rascal, making the Fusion DPS line look out of sorts, getting picked early. They were also very successful at shutting down Mono, and the Dragons in general were really shutting down Mono, which allowed Fate to go a bit more aggressive and really win a lot of team fights. So some of the best maps in this game were on the control maps, where they were just completely scrappy and chaotic, and just so much fun to watch. This one really could have went the other way on any other day, but the Dragons move on in the May Melee. The second game of the East Division was between the number 2 seeded Seoul Dynasty and the number 3 seeded Chengdu Hunters, and this one was a lot more one-sided. With a 3-1 scoreline, the Chengdu Hunters upset the Dynasty, but I don't think this was much of an upset, as many, including myself for the tourney, believed that Chengdu would be the better team. While there was nothing too glaring individually for Seoul, it really felt like Seoul overthought this match and tried to force a lot of unfavorable fights, instead of just resetting and going again. For Chengdu, Leave and Gaga continued to dominate, as the Hunters as a team looked pretty calm and methodical in their fights. The only other thing I would really like to say about this match was that the Zens in the control map for the first control map, I believe it was Busan, both Creative and Faraway were doing almost as much work as their respective DPSs. So if you like deadly aggro supports, it was a good map to watch. And now, with this weekend, the Dragons and Hunters will face off against the best of the West Division. And the best of the West Division was decided after a few extra games, as the 6 teams playing for their chance to head to Hawaii to face the Dragons and Hunters were the Toronto Defiant, Florida Mayhem, Washington Justice, San Francisco Shock, Dallas Fuel, and Houston Outlaws. The Defiant and Mayhem clashed first, with the winner taking on the Justice for the first spot, and the Shock took on the Fuel for a chance to play the Outlaws for the second spot. As for my predictions, I was completely wrong, thinking that the Houston Outlaws and the Washington Justice would be the top teams in the West, as the Florida Mayhem and the Dallas Fuel are the ones heading to Hawaii to take on the East. So starting with the Florida Mayhem's run, the Mayhem first had to take on the Toronto Defiant, who they easily defeated 3-0. In this game, the Mayhem were not punished for OG's aggression, and in fact the Defiant struggled against the aggression of the entirety of the Mayhem. Toronto's decision to focus on nanoing their McCree tended to allow OG and the DPS to clean up the Defiant's backline, while a lack on the nano on their tank line prevented Toronto from doing the same. In the second game, the Mayhem had a little bit more trouble with the Washington Justice, winning 3-1, as the Justice were a little bit better at handling the aggression from the Mayhem. In this game, Mayhem did look fantastic, especially OG, but I was also highly impressed with both BQB and Yaki, who dominated their DPS counterparts. The Washington Justice definitely looked better on the dive, which was the comp played on the map that the Justice won, but the Mayhem just looked much better on the rush style, which ultimately is going to lead them to face the East in the May Melee. As for the other West Division champion, through the knockouts, the Dallas Fuel simply dominated. Dallas beat both the San Francisco Shock and the Houston Outlaws 3-0, in what was some one-sided games. Dallas has really found something that worked for them, and a lot of that goes to Sparkle's Symmetra play, while the Fuel was playing Rush. Fielder also looked really good in both games. Against the Fuel, the Shock looked like they didn't respect the players on the Fuel, and they took a lot of team fights that they really shouldn't have, investing ults and still losing the fight when they ultimately should have reset. On the contrary, the Houston Outlaws didn't really look bad or anything. They didn't make any grievous mistakes, but the Fuel just were popping off, and it was their day to win. These are teams that, honestly, any other day, any other week, it could have went the other way. It could have been Shock. It could have also been the Outlaws. If you guys don't remember, the reason why the Outlaws were ranked so highly, they were second overall in the rankings, was because they beat both Dallas and Shock. So this was definitely a redemption game for Dallas, but ultimately it could have went either direction. And now we move on to the final games in the first stage of the Overwatch League 2021 season and the May Melee. Starting Thursday, we'll see the Dallas Fuel and Florida Mayhem represent the West Division and take on their counterparts in the East Division, the Chengdu Hunters and the Shanghai Dragons. I'll be making my predictions for the weekend before the games start, and we'll look at that next week after what I expect to be a fantastic weekend of Overwatch. So that's going to be it for this week. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you guys next time. Bye!